Hello there, this is Charlotte Reeves from Unleashed Education, and today I'm sharing with you another tip for your editing toolbox. So I think we can agree we all love to see sparkly, sharp eyes in our dog photos. And don't you hate it when you miss focus? It can happen when the dog is really random and quick, when animal autofocus fails you, or when you're shooting with a really shallow depth of field. I know it's definitely happened to me in the past. So first up, how do you tell if the eyes are in focus or not? What I like to do is always zoom into 100%. I find it sometimes a bit pointless to zoom in any further than 100%, because then everything kind of looks a bit blurry and indistinct, and you're going to see a lot more noise, and it's really going to sway your opinion of the quality of your image. So I recommend not zooming in any further than 100%. Now, if you have a look at Enzo's eyes here, you can see they're just very slightly soft. And a good way to try and identify blurry eyes or eyes that have had missed focus is to try and see if you can spot where the focus plane has gone. So you can do that by identifying where the sharpest part of the image is. Looking here, you can kind of see that the very corners of Enzo's eyes, so all that fur there is quite sharp, but his actual eyeballs are just out of focus. Now we're shooting with a 50mm lens. It's actually an f1.2 lens at f1.2. So the plane of focus is super shallow, especially when you're zoomed in quite closely to the dog's face like this. Now let's have a look and see what in focus eyes look like, just as a comparison. We've got Opal here. So as you can see, the sharpest part of this view here, now that we're zoomed into 100%, is her actual eyeballs. You can see very sharp-edged catch lights. You can see very sharp-edged reflections in the eyes. And the hair around here, in the corners here and between her eyes, is not in focus because the plane of focus is going straight through both of her eyes. Let's have a look at this one of Fletcher here. So as you can see, same thing. The sharpest thing in the photo is definitely these gorgeous little eyeballs here. So we've got a very sharply defined catch light and the reflection, which is actually me in the reflection taking the photo. So that's what sharp eyes look like. Now let's take a look at this one of Enzo here. So this one was taken a little bit before the one that was out of focus. As you can see, this is what his eyes are meant to look like when they're sharp. Again, very sharply defined catch lights and reflections in the eyes, and you can see all the structure of the eye as well. There's nothing blurry or indistinct about those. So I guess the next question is, does it matter? In some cases, it may not really matter if the eyes are just very slightly out of focus, like they are in this shot here. From a distance, it doesn't look too bad. When you're looking at the full image, kind of smallish on the screen, not taking up the full screen, you can't really tell. So if you are only going to be sharing images online or printed small, it probably doesn't matter too much if you've missed focus just a little bit. When it does matter is if you're going to be printing your work and printing your work large. As soon as this gets blown up to kind of life size on the wall, you're really going to notice the fact that the sharpest part here are definitely these hairs in the corners of his eyes here towards the middle of his face rather than his eyes. It's going to be especially obvious if you print on a shiny substrate, so something like metallic or acrylic. That really tends to show up both noise and sharpness issues. So even if you don't go in and do a fix for this on every single image that maybe you show to a client or that you share online, it's good to know what is and isn't possible when it comes to sharpening or rescuing eyes that are very slightly out of focus like this. So the big question here is, can you fix this in Lightroom? I'm a big proponent of Lightroom. I love it. I use it for probably 99% of all the editing tasks that I do. If I can get away with doing it in Lightroom, generally that's what I'll do because it's a lot quicker and a lot easier for most things. So you can sharpen these eyes up to a certain extent here in Lightroom. I've created a little mask here. So let's just turn this on and see where I have selected the eyes. So just the eyeballs I've selected. I'll just turn that overlay off. Now, if I turn this adjustment off and on, you'll see that it's definitely sharpened up the eyes a bit. It's given a little bit more structure. It's given some harder edges in the eyes. It gives the appearance of being sharp. But in order to do this, I've had to use some of these sliders that also maybe overcook the eyes a little bit. It's not only targeting the sharpness of the eyes, but it's also targeting the edge definition. And to do that, it's sort of messing with other things as well. So the sliders that I've used here, I've taken the whites up and the blacks down to get some more contrast. That often gives the appearance of sharpness. I've taken the texture and the clarity both up quite a way. And I've also taken the sharpness up a little. Often that can make it look a bit grainy, so I've taken the noise reduction up a little bit as well. So let's just turn that off and on. And let's just have a look at that in the context of the whole image. See how, and I mean, Enzo does have some pretty spectacularly colored eyes, but it really does make those eyes look a little bit overdone. So let's turn that off and let's take this image into Photoshop instead, and I'll show you how I use Topaz to sharpen the eyes. So I've just opened this image up in Photoshop. Let's zoom into 100% here. Now, I was super resistant to using Topaz plugins for a really long time. I didn't really trust them. I didn't know exactly how they worked. They were an extra expense. And I was pretty sure I could get just as good a result from doing it in the other ways that I was using. But since diving in about 3 months ago and investing in the Sharpen and the Denoise plugins, I've come to see that I was wrong. And these plugins really are quite amazing, and they're now an invaluable part of my workflow for certain images, not for every single image, but for certain images that need it. So I like to use the plugins here in Photoshop, and I always duplicate the background layer and apply the plugin to that layer so I can mask out areas that I don't want those adjustments applying to, and also so I can reduce the opacity of that layer to kind of tone down the adjustments that the Topaz filter does, because sometimes they can be just a little bit too strong. So once I've created the background copy layer, I go into Filter, let's go into Sharpen AI. Now, when you come in, you can press this little toggle up here and it will actually select the best option that it thinks is going to work for the image. Now, it's selected out of focus, very noisy. It hasn't really fixed the eyes much, so I'm going to change that. And instead, I'm going to go into out of focus, very blurry. So on the left, we've got the original. On the right, we've got the filter applied. Have a look at this eye on the left here. See how we can actually see so much more detail in that eye now. And also the eye on the right, you can see a very defined edge of the catch light and a much more defined silhouette of me standing there taking the photo in Enzo's eye. So under model parameters here, you can turn the auto off and move these sliders manually. So I'd like to get a little bit more sharpness. So I'm going to just go up a little bit with the remove blur. And I think that's helped to get just a little bit of extra definition in the eyes. I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to click apply. So here's the key step for using this in Photoshop. We don't want to apply this adjustment that it's made to the entire image because it's done some weird stuff. It's tried to sharpen all kinds of things that don't need sharpening. We only want to apply this to the eyeballs. So we're going to make sure that background copy layer is selected. I'm going to add a mask, and if I hold down Option when I click the Add Layer Mask button in the Layers palette here, it'll actually add a black mask. Now that hides that layer completely. So now we've gone back to the out of focus eyes. What we want to do is grab a white brush. So I'm going to press B on the keyboard, or you can just go and select the brush from over here. I'm going to make sure that white is my foreground color in the color picker here. If you want to set this back to the default colors, just press D on the keyboard. If black is the foreground color and white is the background, you can very easily swap those by pressing X on the keyboard. Now, I generally always use a brush that has about 0% hardness, and I adjust the size with the left and right brackets on the keyboard. So I'm just going to go in here, zoom in a little bit more. I'm allowed to zoom in because I'm not pixel peeping. I'm just zooming in so I can see what I'm doing a bit better. So I'm going to paint with the white brush. Make sure the mask is selected rather than the actual layer itself. And I'm just going to go in here and paint in on the eyeball here. And I may even, to make it look a bit more realistic, I may go a little bit outside the eyeball too, to give a little bit of sharpness to the fur, kind of around the eyelids, because that would make sense from a depth of field, planar focus type perspective. Okay, the other eyeball here. Wow, look at how much that sharpens that up. I'm going to go a little bit out here as well, sharpen some of these little hairs. Yeah, that looks amazing. So let me just turn that layer off and on so you can see the difference that that's made. It's also sharpened up a little eye booger there, but don't worry, I always get rid of those before I finish the image. So let's have a look at 100% again. Let's turn that layer off and on. And there we go. Now I think I'm actually going to use the full effect of this. If this was a bit much, I could quite easily just take that opacity down and it would make it a little bit less strong, that effect. But for this, they needed quite a bit of sharpening, so I'm going to leave that at 100% opacity. So that's basically it. We now have some nice, sharp, sparkly, shiny, reflective eyeballs, which is exactly what we want to do. Now, I tend to do that before I do any other types of eye enhancements. Getting the eyes sharp is probably the most important thing. And of course, if you do have an image that does have sharp eyes and is a better image overall, you would use that one instead. This is only like a last resort if you don't have anything else that you can use. But if you do need to fix them, that's how. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and I'll be back soon with another tool to add to your editing toolbox.